So a lot, I mean a lot of the Brexiteers, not only pre-2016, but during the referendum and even post-referendum, were pretty much sticking to the idea that, of course, leaving the EU would somehow benefit UK industries. Now, of course, they never said exactly what it was. Mainly it was just, oh, they'll have opportunities in other countries. And again, just saying that does not actually create the reality. Because, for example, steel, which we are talking about today, is probably one of really the very few last big heavy industry jobs that are available in the north. And it is quite a big employment sector still in the north, with very, very good pay rates for low skilled workers. I mean, I think at a steel plant, and again, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that the starting wage for an unskilled worker in a steel plant is something for around 25,000 a year, and that is on unskilled wage. Obviously, you will get trained, and obviously that will become more. So obviously, these jobs are in quite high demand, and they are available and they are there. And of course, as we saw when the mining strike happened, led to massive job losses of people who had really good high incomes no longer had that income anymore. It led to huge devastation in this area. So the fact that we are seeing today that the government is potentially going to scrap plans for essentially stopping cheap steel being flooded into the country, which again are EU rules, by the way, and we'll get more into this later in the article, but yeah, we could see a flood of cheap steel come into this country. And this, again, keeps with the free market. Again, we've said before that the free market fundamentalists are perfectly fine with that happening because, as they are want to do, the market should dictate who wins and who loses, regardless of what happens to the local industry. So if there is a massive, dumping, shall we say, of cheap Chinese steel into the UK when these rules come out, and then that destroys our own, national industry for this thing, well then, so be it. Because who cares? We can get cheap steel from China. They don't care. And those are the people who are in charge and who advocated for Brexit and who conned people into thinking that, leaving Brexit would somehow benefit these industries. So before we jump into today's article, please do remember to hit that like, share and subscribe button. And of course, down below there is a link to my Patreon page, as well as a one-off donation link called Buy Me a Coffee, where you can, buy me a coffee. And as always, thank you very much to all those people who do support the channel. So, this comes from the Yorkshire Post today. Good old Yorkie Post. So, the title is, Labour warns International Trade Secretary Liz Truss that scrapping safeguards on steel imports could put thousands of jobs at risk across the north. In a letter seen by the Yorkshire Post to the International Trade Secretary Liz Truss, Labour says that the proposed removal of safeguards could be the final straw that forces some factories and steel mills to close down for good. The government's Trade Remedies Investigations Directorate, or the TRID, recommended on Wednesday that a number of measures to protect the UK steel industry from imports are to be cut from July. Under the current restrictions that were in place when the UK was a member of the European Union, 19 types of imported steel were subject to tariffs and quotas to safeguard UK suppliers. So the evil EU protecting our industry. How dare they? The TRID has recommended removing restrictions on 9 types of steel, but maintaining restrictions on the remaining 10 for at least another 3 years. It claimed that the types of steel to have import rules eased were not manufactured in the UK, or there were no increase in imports. Stainless steel bars and metallic coated sheets are among those items that could see import restrictions lifted. In a letter to the Leeds-educated Miss Truss, Liz shadows Trade Minister Bill Emerson and Shadow Business Minister Shalmi Mahar have demanded that she override the advice of the TDR and keep in place all existing safeguards against unfair trading practices in the global steel market. But the government says it can only choose between accepting the TRDI's recommendations or see that the safeguards expire at their end date. Labour has also described the TDR recommendations as reinforcing long-standing concerns the part has played on rising regarding the implementation of the Trade Remedies Authority, or by the DIT. In the letter, Labour states there has not been enough emphasis on the fair safeguards which domestic producers and their workers should expect from their government. It says that if you remove some of those safeguards in the way that the TRDI has recommended, the UK is likely to become a magnet for large quantities of foreign steel. A 2% increase in global overproduction could decimate all demand for British steel, and the removal of safeguards could be the final straw that forces factories and steel mills to close down for good. The TRID recommends and also suggests a worrying misunderstanding of how the steel industry works in the UK. The full spectrum of measures is tried to design to protect the viability of steel as a whole, not just individual production lines. Instead of the removal of safeguards suggested to you by the TRDI, would mean that the manufacture of steel sections, tubes, wire rods and plates in the UK are put at risk, with huge consequences for jobs and communities in Teesside, Hartlepool, Cardiff, Scunthorpe, Rotherham and Motherwell, as well as elsewhere, who rely on these industries for their livelihoods. After the preeminent decision by the TRDI was announced on Wednesday, there will be a 7-day period in which interested parties can comment on the report. The TDI will then consider and produce a final decision on which is to be sent to mistrust, who will then make the final decision on whether to uphold the TRDI's recommendation. Last month, a report said that the Yorkshire and the North would become a world leader in green steel in a move which could save thousands of jobs across the regions if ministers and industry leaders acted now. And if you remember, we went over that. The region's historic but carbon-intensive steel industry could achieve a net zero status by 2035, according to the think tank NPPRI, and is harnessing the North by harnessing the potential of electrification, carbon capture storage, and hydrogen technologies. Its report is backed by many of the region's politicians and business figures, and say that it is the decarbonisation the northern steel would cost on average of $267 million a year by 2015, but it would help lay the foundations for a stronger, low carbon and productive industry. And it says that the rewards and acting quickly should be significant, with economies around the world likely to also start to imposing extra charges on materials produced by more polluting methods. Highly technical and vocational education would be critical to these skills, and a pipeline that the industry in the North will need, meaning the low-carbon steel industry of the future must start training the workforce of tomorrow today. It comes amid the uncertainty of the industry's short-term future, with the collapse of the lender Greensill Capital threatening thousands of jobs at Liberty Steel sites in Rotherham, Stockbridge and Scunthorpe. On May the 25th, MPs on the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Committee will be questioning Business Secretary Kersey Katang about Liberty Steel and the future of the UK steel industry. The hearing is likely to question the Secretary of State on the government's assessment of Liberty Steel, and it hopes to intervene and also examine the lessons which have been learned since the last major crisis in the steel industry in 2015 and 16. A Department for International Trade spokesperson said, "We have a robust trade remedies and framework via the TDI to protect UK producers from unfair trading practices and foreign surges in imports. This government supports free trade for British steel manufacturers." The Secretary of State has limited powers in the realisation of the TRA and has only the choice under law to accept the recommendations or that see that safeguard measures expire at their end date. So already we can see exactly the same bizarre talking points that we saw about not only the fishing industry, but we have seen about the farming industry. And look what's happened to those two industries recently. They got absolutely thrown under the bus. First of all, fishing with basically almost no fishing beyond domestic fishing really happening, and the farming industry, well, as essentially looks like that the government is about to sign a death by 1,000 cuts trade deal with Australia that could lead to other countries demanding exactly the same thing, and that would absolutely decimate our UK agricultural industry. And now we are potentially looking at, once again, the government saying, oh, we'll help the steel industry by again, and nothing comes out. It's just, we're going to protect the steel industry. Well, okay, how do you intend to do that? Like we went over that article last month, I do 100% agree that the idea of trying to create a carbon-friendly steel industry is possible. The technology is there. The training could be done. This could open the opportunity to actually create hundreds of thousands of good green jobs in the steel industry. But the government has to act now. It cannot sleep on this. And again, if Boris Johnson is actually serious about levelling up the North, as he claims, then the steel industry and this decarbonisation of the steel industry, which again will help to save hundreds of thousands of jobs and help to create a new workforce for the future and secure jobs for the future, ain't going to happen. Because we're talking about this investment being like, what, 2035, maybe 2050 before we actually see full fruits of this type of investment. And as we've said before, our government ain't about long-term investment. It's about short-term, meaning short-term wins. They do not care what happens so long as the next election they can win. And unfortunately, that is not good news for our steel industry and hundreds of thousands of people that it employs up and down, not only just in the north, but also in places like Wales, where there's a strong steel industry presence, and also elsewhere in the country. This is, again, not looking good. And once again, looks like that potentially the steel industry could very well be the next industry that gets thrown under the Brexit bus. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. Do please remember to hit that like, share and subscribe button. And of course, down below there is a link to my Patreon page, as well as a one-off donation link called Buy Me a Coffee, where you can, well, buy me a coffee. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you all next time.